Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to the 7th Annual Tom E. Moses Memorial Lecture on the U.S. Constitution. And I'm so happy to see a full house, given that you had to come through rain and sleet and dark of night, or was it hail? I'm David Hostetter. I'm the program director here at the Robert C. Byrd Center for Legislative Studies. And we're here to celebrate Constitution Day, which was established in 2005 through the leadership of Senator Robert C. Byrd. It is celebrated on or near September 17th each year because it was on that date in 1787 that delegates meeting in Philadelphia approved the U.S. Constitution. Events are held at educational institutions and government facilities all across the country. Senator Byrd was well known for his constitutional expertise and for carrying a pocket constitution with him at all times. I have long admired the Senator's understanding of the Constitution, as well as his ability to hang on to a pocket copy. I'm afraid if I tried to do that, it would end up being a well-laundered copy. But new technology has solved this dilemma. For those of you who have smartphones, you will find a variety of free Constitution apps at the various app stores, and I encourage you to make use of this instant access to our founding document, but not now. Please silence your cell phones for the duration of this event. The smooth functioning of tonight's event is the result of the hard work of the Byrd Center staff. I wish to thank and acknowledge my colleagues Ray Smock, our director, Billy Phipps, our office manager, Mark Levitt, and Keith Alexander, our archivists, for the effort they have put into this event, and will be contributing to the lecture by Richard Dreyfuss, who will be here on Saturday evening at 6 p.m. If you plan on attending that event, well, it is at 6, and the doors will open at 5:30. Each September during the week of the 17th, we bring a distinguished scholar citizen to the Byrd Center to talk about the United States Constitution. This lecture series was established by the three daughters of Tom Moses, Lynn Yellett, Merle Crawford, and Jerry Moses Eichler, who are sitting with us tonight, to commemorate their father and the way he lived his life. Tom Moses was a selfless humanitarian who dedicated his life to defending the U.S. Constitution and pursuing social justice. He was an extremely modest man who didn't like to be in the limelight, but his family wants you to know something about him. During World War II, he volunteered as a medical paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne and was awarded the Bronze Star. He started the first welfare rights organization in the United States. He was involved with the Joe Must Go movement in the 1950s to recall Senator Joseph McCarthy. In the 1960s, he was active in fair housing initiatives and other civil rights work, and he played a critical role in persuading Senator Byrd to oppose the flag desecration amendment. During the 27 years Tom lived in Jefferson County, he championed successful litigation regarding reapportionment in West Virginia, resulting in an additional state delegate seat. He started the Eastern Panhandle chapter of the ACLU West Virginia and served many years on the state ACLU board. He was appointed by Governor Rockefeller to serve on the board of the Potomac Center for Individuals with Disabilities. He was the first paid professional staff person for the United Way of Jefferson County and was honored with the prestigious Van Ryzen Award. He served on the Jefferson County Parks and Recreation Commission and was president and treasurer of Meals on Wheels. The historical figure that Tom most admired was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson once said, "Educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty." It is in that spirit we continue Tom's work tonight, and if he were here with us, he would be extremely pleased and encouraged that all of you came tonight, and he would thank you from the bottom of his heart. Our speaker tonight is Bob Edgar, who is the president of Common Cause, a national nonpartisan nonprofit citizens lobby that strives to make government at all levels more honest, open, and accountable, and to connect citizens with their democracy. Bob arrived at Common Cause in 2007 with a long history of leadership in public service that included 12 years in Congress. He was the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the USA for 7 years, immediately before arriving at Common Cause. Bob was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1974 to represent the 7th Congressional District of Pennsylvania near Philadelphia. And Bob was part of the congressional class nicknamed the Watergate Babies.
Yay!
Who were those elected in the wake of the Watergate scandal and who led sweeping reforms of Congress. Bob ran unsuccessfully for the U.S. Senate in 1986 against Senator Arlen Specter. That race fueled his frustration with the undue influence of money in politics, and he became an active supporter of clean elections and campaign finance reform, issues that have long been Common Cause's hallmark. He served on Common Cause's National Governing Board for several years before becoming president of the organization. Bob earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree from Lycoming College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and a Master of Divinity degree from the Theological School of Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. He has served as president of the Claremont School of Theology and holds 5 honorary doctoral degrees. Bob is also an author of the book Middle Church, a call to progressive people of faith to take back the moral high ground from the extremists and make America a better and less divided country. Bob's topic tonight is democracy at risk. In conjunction with his lecture, he has referred us to speeches by journalist Bill Moyers and the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., copies of which are available on the table outside the auditorium. Bob has also been a good organizer and brought me a mailing list sign up for Common Cause, which will be circulating. You can sign up and have email from Common Cause and get more information on these topics. With that in mind, please welcome Bob Edgar.
In the introduction, you said that I was unsuccessful in my race for the United States Senate. I actually came in second. I got the silver. Might have been one of the best things that happened to me is to serve 6 terms in the House of Representatives and then run for the Senate, get the silver medal, and then do some other things, which I'll talk about in a second. Before we begin, I've got 3 things that I need to do. The first is I have a really bad joke that's stuck down here. And I know there are people out there in the overflow room, so I hope you'll laugh at the joke over there. But just help me with this joke.
Please tell your joke.
I now have permission. It's my favorite joke, but I gotta get rid of it. You heard the story about the mother mouse that walks across the field, and she has behind her all her baby mice, all the little mices, and she's just as happy as can be. She walks about halfway across the field, and you guessed it, a large cat comes in the other direction. The mother mouse gets up on her hind legs to protect the little ones, and she looks the cat in the eye and she says, "Bow wow!" The cat runs off, and the mother mouse turns to the little ones and says, "Now you know the value of a second language." That's number 1. Number 2, I was a Methodist preacher for 12 years. I was a congressman. I was head of the National Council of Churches. I ran the Committee for National Security. My wife says I can't hold a job. Now I'm at Common Cause. I have all these different vocations that scribble inside of me. And I'd like to go back to my first vocation and ask all of you, including those of you in the overflow room, to stand and put your hand on someone's shoulder next to you. You can do that. Please stand. Put your hand on the shoulder. That's good. I need somebody to put their hand on my shoulder. And now that you're standing, I want you to kind of recognize that if democracy is at risk, the only people available to fix it are us. We're all connected. So I want you to repeat after me. We are.
We are.
We are.
We are.
The leaders.
The leaders.
We have been waiting for.
We have been waiting for.
Let's do one more chant. It's an African proverb. Very simple proverb. If you want to walk fast,
If you want to walk fast,
walk alone.
walk alone.
If you want to walk far,
If you want to walk far,
walk together.
walk together.
You can be seated. I wish all the students who are in the other room could be here because who are students here? We got a couple. You guys are smart. So help me get started in this lecture. I've got a couple questions to ask you before we begin. The first question is, how many years has the Earth been in existence and I'll give you within a billion. We got the college president here. I know she knows. I won't put her on the spot to get the number, but shout out to me. How many years this planet Earth has been around for a while? It took a long time to make the oil and gas that we use. How many years has the Earth been in existence? There's a hand here. 5 billion. 4.6. 7,000?
Yes, my guess.
7,000 years. Through carbon dating, we probably can say that you are right. Give or take a billion, we've been around for 5 billion years. Give or take a billion. Okay? Now, human life wasn't on the planet all of those years, but the Earth's been around for 5 billion years. Here's the second question. How many years has human life been on the planet? We have a delegate here. He probably knows. But just guess, how many years has human life been on the planet? We were hairier at one time. We looked a little bit different than we look now. But just shout out some numbers. How many years has human life been on the planet?
6,000.
6,000. Okay.
Hallelujah.
1.2 million. Others? 30,000. 100 million. I don't have a clue. Here's what I do know. After 5 billion years of the Earth's existence, scientists tell us we reached a population of 1 billion brothers and sisters on planet Earth on or about 1830. That's 30 years before the Civil War. In 1830, we were beginning the gold rush in California. In Pennsylvania, we had discovered oil, but remember, we hadn't invented machines yet. In 1830, there were 1 billion people wanting access to clean air and clean water. It took us however many years that there was human life on planet Earth to get to 1830 when we reached 1 billion. Now, in January of 1930, 100 years later, shortly after the Depression, we reached 2 billion people on planet Earth. Why do you think it only took 100 years to add an extra billion?
Agriculture.
Agriculture. Clean water. Medicine. We ended death at childbirth for most women. We invented vaccines for children, so children 0 to 5 years of age lived longer. Life expectancy went from about 35 to 40 years of life expectancy up into the 50s, up into the 60s. When Social Security was put in place in the mid-30s, life expectancy for men was about 62 and for women was about 65. But we had 2 billion brothers and sisters on planet Earth in 1930. 30 years after that, in January of 1960, when John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon were vying for the presidency, we reached 3 billion people on planet Earth. It only took 30 years to add that extra billion. I was still in high school. And then 15 years later, at age 31, I got elected by accident to the United States Congress. The highest office I held before getting elected to Congress was being vice chairman of my son's parent-teachers organization. I had never been to Washington to watch a legislative session. I got mad on October 20th, 1973 at Richard Nixon. Do you know why I got mad on that date? No. It was a Saturday night. The Saturday Night Massacre, for those younger people here. There was a special prosecutor looking into Watergate. His name was Archibald Cox. He later became chair of the board and a group called Common Cause, which I now am president of. But Archibald Cox was summarily dismissed by Richard Nixon when Richard Nixon was asked to give over the Watergate tapes. I was living in suburban Philadelphia. I was chaplain at Drexel University. I was happy being an urban pastor and a campus chaplain. I had just helped to found the People's Emergency Center, which was the first shelter in the city of Philadelphia that cared for women and families. There were 3 shelters for men, 0 shelters for women. July 1st, 1972, we opened a shelter. We took an old church where it was open 1 hour a week, and we didn't ask permission, we didn't get permits. We just invited women and children and families to come. We thought we'd help 200 families over the course of the first year. We helped 2,000 women and children. The bad news is the organization still exists. It now has 80 employees in Philadelphia. It's done a great job of trying to help particularly women who are in abusive situations and other kinds of traumas. That was the vocational intention. But I got so mad at Richard Nixon, I looked the word Democratic up in the telephone book and began to discover that the last time a Democrat won an election in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, was in 1858, which was slightly before the Civil War. And the last candidate to run lost by 42,000 votes. And everybody said it's impossible to win. So on February 4th, 1974, I announced my candidacy. I ran in a primary. I got 6,000 votes. My opponent got 3,000 votes. Republicans had a primary. One got 59,000, the other got 49,000. But then Ehrlichman, Halderman, John Dean, and were on television every day in the Watergate hearings. Richard Nixon resigns, and I won by 19,000 votes and moved in 1 year from being a Protestant chaplain to being a United States congressperson. What startled me when I was standing in the well of the House in January of 1975 were these facts. First, getting back to my illustration, we didn't have 3 billion people on planet Earth. We now have 4 billion. It only took 15 years to add that extra billion population to planet Earth. As I was being sworn in, standing next to Peter Rodino, Morris Udall, in the well of the House of Representatives, with the Watergate baby class, 75 Democrats and 17 Republicans, I was struck by the fact that the people around me were no smarter or dumber than I was. We put 435 egos in the House of Representatives, call that the House. We take 100 people, 2 from each state, put them in the Senate. 535 egos make up the Congress of the United States. I'll say more about that later. Anyway, there are now 4 billion people on planet Earth, and I'm a member of the United States Congress. I served 6 terms, 12 years, leave Congress after the voters of Pennsylvania elected me to do so by coming in second on the Senate race. I left in January of 1987. There were 5 billion people on planet Earth. The United Nations says on or about October 15th, 1999, there are now going to be 6 billion people on planet Earth. The reason I'm telling you this story is this year, 2011, we now have 7 billion brothers and sisters inhabiting planet Earth. Here are 2 facts I want you to remember. More than 1/2 of all the people who ever lived on planet Earth are alive today. Let me say that one more time. More than half of all the people who ever lived on planet Earth are alive today. The other statistic I want you to think about is that 95% of everything created by human hands has been created in the last 100 years. We all think that history is gradual, and yet if you think about it, those of you who understand about oil being found in Pennsylvania in 1830, those of us who might be called ourselves progressives, understand we've consumed 2/3 of all the oil and gas that is easily accessible in this fragile planet Earth. And my friends who are conservatives, people to the far right, and maybe some in the room, and that's good, they say, oh, that's foolish. We have 500 years of oil and gas and resources in the ground. And I take their position and say, what right do children born 501 years from now have to some of these non-renewable resources that we're consuming at such an accelerated rate? Now, the reason I wanted to start by talking about the state of the world in which we live and pointing out this population change, and I could take another hour to talk about the consumption of non-renewable resources, is we are the most unique generation in all of human history. We're literally the first generation that can destroy planet Earth. And we can do it with an explosion of a nuclear weapon, or we can do it drip by drip because we don't dispose of our chemicals in a proper way. We can, in fact, soil the very home, this very small planet on which we live. That's the context around which we've got to talk about democracy. This is a great experiment. 200 and some years ago, a handful of people got together and wanted to resist against the leaders, the kings and the monarchs and the dictators of that time. And they came to the United States, and they started actually pretty badly. In the faith communities, we started killing each other, or calling each other witches, and isolating each other. And eventually we evolved into a nation that's not a Christian nation, it's a nation that respects all faith traditions. And our founding fathers weren't perfect. They created a great constitution and a great Bill of Rights, but it was mostly for men, and it was mostly for white people, or people who were non-African American. But this nation had the seeds of democracy planted deep inside the soul of the nation. And as we've evolved over time, even in my lifetime, we've seen enormous changes. From Brown versus Board of Education, to a woman who was courageous enough to sit in a different seat on a bus, to a young preacher who stood up when others told him to sit down, and who spoke out when others told him to be silent. I mentioned that I'm the Forrest Gump of religion and politics. I could go back and talk about the fact that my first church was in the coal regions of Pennsylvania, next to the Gilbert and Coal Company, which was a nasty coal company. The people of that community were poor. They didn't own the outside of their houses. They only owned the inside. And the coal company came and strip mined the houses, and were very devastating. I learned stuff about poor people and the dignity of poor people. I could talk about that. But I want to mention the first point at which I see myself as a Forrest Gump person. I was a senior at theological school at Drew University. I was invited by William Sloane Coffin, who at that time was the chaplain at Yale University, to come to Washington to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. A group of laymen and clergy persons came together in March of 1968 to talk about the war in Vietnam and poverty. At that time, anyone who questioned the government was still in the kind of the shadow of the McCarthy era. In fact, when we got off the bus in front of the church, having come down from New Jersey and Delaware and down through Maryland, when we got off the bus, the religious radicals of that day was led by a guy by the name of Carl McIntyre, who was carrying signs, picket signs that said, "Kill a commie for Christ's sake," and trying to prevent us from going into the church to make the connection between war and poverty. You can imagine, I was 22 years of age. I broke my family tradition. My father was a blue-collar worker and said, never cross a picket line. I crossed the picket line, went into the church, went up into the balcony, sat in the balcony, and listened to person after person make this connection. But the most fascinating voice was a young clergy person. His name was Dr. Martin Luther King. He walked down the center aisle. He went up and he stood in the podium, and he spoke to us. He reminded us that you and I will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. But the thing that was etched in my mind, and by the way, 10 years later when I was a young member of Congress, I was one of the 12 members of the Select Committee on Assassination looking into the death of Dr. Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy. I'm one of the few people who actually interviewed James Earl Ray at the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. I like the dreamer better than the assassin. But on that day, Dr. King repeated a statement that he had made 1 year earlier. And that statement is in a speech that I've put outside of this venue if you want to take it. It was Dr. King's speech at Riverside Church where he had the conversion of connecting poverty with the war effort in Vietnam. The fact that we were spending so much on the war that we were not spending on caring for the poor. He said this: we were faced with the conundrum of life. He said, you and I live in a time when we are being called to really look at how we live as brothers and sisters on planet Earth. We are faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us bare, naked, and dejected with lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of humanity does not remain at the flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. He closed his comments by saying, we still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. This may well be humankind's last chance to choose between chaos and community. Fast forward now to 1 year ago in Washington, D.C. The 40th anniversary of Common Cause, a watchdog group which I'm chairing. We bring on Robert Reich, former Labor Secretary, to be the chair of our board, but we bring down Bill Moyers from New York to speak to several hundred people in Washington. It's 9 o'clock at night. People want to go home from this celebration, reception, dinner, and we introduce Bill Moyers to speak. He gives a history from his time in the Johnson administration, in the White House, all the way through to the present. But the core of his speech, much like the speech I heard from Dr. Martin Luther King, the core of his speech is this: this is the most dangerous moment in American history. We're either going to be a nation of and by and for the people, or of and by and for corporations and the wealthy. It startled the audience, stunned us, but it took Common Cause, which has been around for 40 years, now 41, it took this organization, which is genetically nice. How many of you are part of organizations that their DNA is genetically nice? It took us and forced us to think about where do we go from here, chaos or community. The election occurred, midterm election. Some of us were startled by the amount of money that was in that election because in January of that year, 2010, the Supreme Court, by a vote of 5-4, voted to give corporations and labor unions the ability to dip into their corporate treasury and spend that on elections. Now, no one in this room believes that the day before that decision came down, that corporations and labor unions weren't already involved in elections. Our friend Bobby Byrd knew something about raising money for elections, and your other politicians in the state of West Virginia know about money in politics. And we all know that for the last 20 years, maybe 30 years, money is corroding the system. It's not just getting people elected, but people are so sophisticated that Exxon and BP are buying their congresspersons, the insurance companies are buying theirs, the medical industries are buying theirs, the labor groups are buying theirs. And I have this fantasy that if we don't do something about this Citizens United decision, 5-4, if we don't do something to control money in politics, our democracy is in fact going to be a plutocracy, not a democracy, and it's going to be owned and operated by corporate interest and moneyed interest, even more than it is today. Ask yourself about the defense industry. Every one of the 435 congressional districts has some defense contractor in it. Why are we still building weapons that were used in World War II as though that was the same world that we live in today. I mentioned to all of you that we are the leaders we've been waiting for. And don't wait for the House and Senate and the President to make the kinds of changes we need. We've got to stand up and speak more clearly. And I think there are things that we can do to temper this issue of money in politics. But I have to say, in the next 18 months, as we approach the presidential campaign, you're going to see more money in politics than ever before. Obama's already announced that he's going to raise $1 billion. The other side will raise $1 billion or more. And if you add in all of the House races and a third of the senators, you're going to see money taint the system of democracy. And that's why I say, as I did with the title of my talk, democracy is at risk. We're all at risk in terms of the democracy that we want to hold fast to. And that's why we need to go back and not only read the Constitution, but begin to live the Constitution. It's a living document. It's not something that's stuck in history. This document is a great document, but it didn't care very much for people of color. It didn't say very much about women. And this document's a great document. It's a great framework for us to work together. But if we're not careful, democracy is at risk. We are now challenged to say, what do we do about it? How do we begin to make a stand? Now, I've been talking without using notes, and my staff gave me a whole bunch of notes to make sure that I tell you about issues and how we can get at the issue of Citizens United. But before I do that, let me just say, Common Cause decided to be uncommon. Here are just a couple things we've done this year to make us uncommon. In January of this year, we went out to Rancho Mirage, California, and we had a demonstration in front of a spa out in Rancho Mirage where politicians and some of the commentators on some of the conservative television and radio were all gathering with David and Charles Koch, the Koch brothers, who run and operate the second largest private industry in this country. Their combined income, the Koch brothers' income, is $44 billion. They each have $22 billion, given to them by their father, who had started an industry in Kansas and left it to them. And for the last 10 years, twice a year, the Koch brothers have been having secret retreats with corporate leaders and elected officials and commentators to move our democracy in the direction of corporate America. We decided that this was a good target to go and expose this secret retreat. So we showed up, we rented a movie theater and had a panel discussion about democracy at risk. We had a demonstration outside. I've been in lots of demonstrations. It was the gentlest demonstration you'd ever want to see. It blew up in the media because we invited 20 bloggers and social media folks to get the message out, because we couldn't rely on our regular television and radio channels to cover the news. And within weeks, we discovered after our demonstration that the Koch brothers were also involved in helping the governor of Wisconsin to get elected and trying to influence what took place in Wisconsin. And there are lots of other stories. The other thing we discovered by accident when we focused on the Koch brothers and their retreat is that two of our Supreme Court justices, Scalia and Thomas, had visited those retreats. Scalia in 2007, Thomas in 2008, and in 2009 the court did an extraordinary thing. They took this Citizens United versus the FEC case, and rather than deciding on it in 2009, they did an extraordinary thing. They held it over until the fall time frame, and they had an extraordinary hearing in September. And when the decision came out in January, Clarence Thomas's wife got $500,000 from a corporation and began to build a fund to use politically, which she was not able to do prior to the Supreme Court decision. So Common Cause finding this out, sent a letter to the Attorney General, which actually hasn't been answered. And we just asked whether or not there was a conflict of interest, whether or not there was, where we saw smoke, fire, in terms of their attending these secret meetings and the actions of the Supreme Court. We also, by accident, discovered another thing. You may not know it. We have 9 members of our Supreme Court who are not under the code of ethics of all other federal judges. In fact, the Supreme Court doesn't have a published code of ethics. There's no principles of recusal when, in fact, a Supreme Court justice is involved in a case that they're hearing. And so we've been trying to work with the court to get them under Title V of the Judicial Code of Ethics. It's a simple matter. Why should the highest court in the land have the lowest ethical standards? You and I, when we were in elementary school, we were taught that this is a third branch of government, that these 9 people, whether they were conservative, moderate, or liberal, are the final arbiters of justice. We've got some big issues to talk about. Healthcare reform is going to be before the courts. Environmental regulations and global warming is going to be before the courts. And so we and a number of other good government groups are saying, why should that highest court not have strict rules on recusal and strict rules of ethics? Oh, and by accident, we also discovered that Clarence Thomas had misfiled for at least the last 6 years that we could see his financial statements. And within 48 hours of calling it on him, he renovated 21 years of his financial statements. And it was interesting because the Monday after we called him on it and he fixed it, he said, I'm sorry I made the mistake because the reports, these financial reports, were just too complicated. Let me show you how complicated they were. It was a box that said, yes or no, my wife has outside income. And he put no. And yet his wife, through IRS forms and other things, had several $100,000, in excess of $700,000 that we could find, of excessive income. It wasn't that hard. And Scalia, the other justice that we questioned, the day we called him out on Citizens United, he accepted an invitation to go up on Capitol Hill and speak on behalf of the Tea Party. Now, in the Code of Ethics, judges, federal judges, and Supreme Court judges, if they were covered, are not supposed to talk to political parties as parties. They should talk to lawyers, they should talk to academics, they should come here to this institution and talk about the law, but they ought not to be supporting one political party over the other. Common Cause is active in this effort. We think that these guys were involved in a conflict of interest, and we want to expose that. But even if we can't prove the conflict of interest, we want to suggest some changes. We'd like to see a constitutional amendment here in the Constitution added, as many other constitutional amendments were added. We'd like to see an amendment added that says that the House and Senate can regulate money in politics. The Supreme Court said that's not the case, that there's no opportunity for the House and Senate to set limits. The House and Senate can only set voluntary limits on money. We'd like to see that happen. The second thing we'd like to see is we'd like to spread a really good virus of what we call clean elections or public financing. You may not know this, but in Arizona, Maine, and Connecticut, 3 states out of our 50, they have put in place in those 3 states public financing systems where on a voluntary basis people can run for state legislature and state senate and not take any special interest money. We first installed it in Arizona, and the former governor of Arizona was the only governor ever to use a fair elections public financing system. She told me, she said, in order to qualify, I had to raise 2,000 $5 bills. That was the qualifier when she ran for governor. She said it was the first time I had a fundraiser in a poor neighborhood because people only could give me $5. And once she qualified, her opponent decided not to take it. Her opponent had a large checkbook, had his own money, brought former President Bush in to campaign. The way the system works in Arizona, every time the opponent raised a couple $100,000, her public funds didn't match it, but came up enough that she could compete on radio and television, and she got elected. And once elected, she could then serve the public interest and not the special interest. In Maine, the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives is a 34-year-old young woman who was only elected because she ran on a public financing system, took no special interest money, has been in the Maine legislature for the last 8 years, and now serves as Speaker of the Maine House. But here's the best. Remember the governor of Connecticut? He was caught misusing money and frankly went to jail. In Connecticut, they were so embarrassed by political corruption that they, by legislature, put in place a public financing system. And in the 2008 election, 74% of the candidates running for state legislature in the House and Senate used the voluntary system, Republicans and Democrats. 81% of them got elected. And in the years 2008 to 2010, special interests could still lobby. They could bring in their talking points, but they couldn't put the checks on the table. They couldn't invite to the receptions. They couldn't put money behind what they were doing. And they passed some of the best legislation in Connecticut. They passed a bottle bill, an environmental bill that had been stopped by special interest. But they were able to talk about issues, not because of some special interest, but what was in the interest of the people of that state. And Common Cause has a bill before the House and Senate. It's not going to pass in the next 2 years, but last year we moved from 65 co-sponsors to 165 co-sponsors of something called Fair Elections Now, which would voluntarily, we have to do it voluntarily because of the current Supreme Court, would have given House and Senate candidates who wanted to volunteer to run with small contributions. And the bill that we introduced said, if you raise $100 from your district or from your state, it'll be matched by $400 of public funds. If you raise that same $100 by going to New York City, Los Angeles, or Miami, you can keep the $100, but it's not matched. So the special interest would be the local district and the local state from which you come, rather than K Street in Washington. Makes enormous sense. When I ran for Congress the first time, I raised $35,000 to get elected to the United States Congress. My opponent spent $250,000. My last election, I raised $700,000 for the House. My opponent spent $1 million. The average for a House race is $1,250,000 to $1,300,000 for the House. In Pennsylvania, I ran for the Senate. I raised $4 million. Arlen Specter raised $6 million. In 1986, we spent $10 million. I'll say a word about that in a second. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, I guess, the two Senate candidates, Santorum and Casey, they raised $37.5 million. Pencil that out on how much you have to raise per day. Let me just talk in $86. I had to raise $2.5 million in 100 days. In those days, you could only take $1,000 from an individual. So I had to find 25 individuals to give me $1,000 every day, 7 days a week, for 100 days in a row. If I was successful for 7 days and raised $25,000 each of those 7 days, I could buy one 30-second television commercial on each of the 7 media markets in Pennsylvania. And by the way, the Bob Edgar I saw on television, I didn't like him very much. Because it's different when you run for the House, you can retail yourself. When you run across a large state, you wholesale yourself with these silly commercials that we have, both negative commercials and, Hollywood created commercials. In those days, the Cosby Show was the big show. It cost $25,000 to $30,000 for 30 seconds in Philadelphia, Erie, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton. Just think what we're doing to our elected officials. Once elected, they're spending 20 and 30 hours a week raising money for their reelection. And if you have to raise that kind of money, it's easier to go to bundle money from the wealthy and large corporations than it is to raise lots of small contributions from average, ordinary citizens. We're hurting as a nation. Democracy is at risk. And one of the core components of the risky nature of democracy is the issue of money. Common Cause is working on some other issues. I'll say them very quickly. Last year, in the election, which thought about being conservative, we won two great victories, one in California and one in Florida. In California, we took away, Common Cause, took away from the state legislature the ability to draw the lines for their districts. It's now done by an impartial, independent, bipartisan, but also culturally and ethnically diverse commission in California rather than the legislature. That's with the help of Schwarzenegger, who left as governor, but during his time as governor supported the issue of fair redistricting. In Florida, we did the same, not as hard. We put principles in place on redistricting. Redistricting often allows incumbents to protect their seats. Florida is the worst case. How many of you have studied in chemistry or biology amoebas? That's the best way to describe some of the legislative districts in Florida. One district goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf. One district goes down and takes in the family home of the senator who represents that particular area. It's just impossible to think that these are fair elections. And in lots of this redistricting stuff, when it gets locked into the parties making all of these decisions, here's the problem is, about 80% of the districts are only won by one party or the other unless there's a national crisis or unless there's an unusual election. In my district, in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, there were 210,000 Republicans and 90,000 Democrats. And elected a Democrat since before the Civil War. I got elected by accident. That wasn't the miracle. The miracle was I got reelected 5 additional times in that district because I worked in a nonpartisan way on appointments to the academies and on helping people in the constituencies. We need a government that's of and by and for the people. And if we don't push back on Citizens United, if we don't find ways to do redistricting, if we don't find ways to get young people and young adults interested in government, our democracy is at risk. And for those of you guys over there in the other room, you've been propagandized for a whole long time. Your parents have been propagandized. The propaganda is that government is the enemy. You got to get government off your back and out of your pocketbook. Think about that when you're driving on an interstate highway. Our friend Dwight Eisenhower is pretty smart. He called it the Defense Highway Act of 1959, and no one would vote against defense. But he put millions of people to work building the interstate highway system. My only complaint with Eisenhower was he built the best highway system, not the best transportation system. We ought to go back and interface our highways with public transit, with our ports, with our railroads, and fuel-efficient kinds of ways. But it was an effort where we all pulled together and made this important infrastructure. If Gorbachev had done that in Russia, when he pulled the troops out of Eastern Europe, he probably would have been seen as a hero in Russia, because Russia was a world-class military, but a peasant economy. It couldn't get its products to market because it didn't have a transportation system in place. We in America need to recognize that our democracy is at risk if we let that democracy simply fold into the money interest and not into the public interest. And for you young people, think about public service. One of the things I discovered in my life, I used to think that you start at birth and you die, and between birth and death, you get an education and you go to work and you work for the same company for 20, 30, 40 years and you retire. That was my father's experience. He worked 37 years sitting at the same desk at General Electric at Elmwood Avenue in Philadelphia. That's not going to happen today. All of you young people are going to have at least 5 vocations. You're going to have 10 to 15 employers over the course of your lives. The skills that you're learning at the university are skills that will have to be adapted to lots of other opportunities. And I hope that some of you take the opportunity to give public service a try. Some of you can think about the Peace Corps. Some of you can think about social service organizations. Some of you can work in nonprofits, in advocacy work. And some of you can think about running for the school board in your local communities. The radical religious right does an excellent job getting people into school board elections so that they can ban books from the library. What about those who are in the middle, or moderates, or progressives? Why not think about local public service as mayors, as city council, as school board? That's the hardest place to work. And some of you might even think about the Congress of the United States as a vocational opportunity, and to be the Bobby Byrd of this generation, or the Tom Moses. When I was listening to Tom's biography, I thought to myself, yay, here is somebody who recognized that he was one of the leaders that we've been waiting for. What if every one of our colleges and universities sent our young people out recognizing that they have these seasons in their life, and those seasons could be spent in part in public service? And what if every elected official at our state level and at our national level thought of their position as public service? Oh, one radical idea, all right, we've got a delegate here, so I have to be delicate. I think, how many of you like recycling? I think we need to recycle our elected officials, whether they want to or not. I believe in recycling. The one thing I would caution, don't make the term limits too short, because otherwise the lobbyists will run the field and the staff will run the field. But my idea, this was just my idea, it's not Common Cause's idea, I wanted to see the House term change from 2 years to 4, because it's too short to run all the time. I'd have a third of the House up every 2 years, so you'd have a little bit of way of doing what they did last night in New York, a Republican one in a Democratic area. That sends a message, everybody gets frightened about it. It's okay to have change. And I would give House members 3 terms or 12 years. And what I saw is even the best congressmen in their 10th and 11th year who wanted to be there for the rest of their life started weaving their voting patterns because they knew where they could get the most special interest money. And even some of my best friends who were heroes on certain issues could, behind the scenes, get money for their re-elections by simply voting a particular way on a particular bill. And I think we need to recycle. We've got John Dingell, a Democrat. His father was in that district before he came off of being a page and has now been a congressperson for over 55 years. It's hard for me to believe that no one else in that district could have represented that area. And even as good, this is going to be sacrilegious, even as good as Bobby Byrd was, he was good, but I also think we need to recycle our senators. I give House members 4 years, give them 3 terms, recycle them every 12 years. I give senators 6 years and 3 terms and recycle them every 18 years. Here's my most radical view. I don't think you need to agree with it, so it's just me. I think we need a 1-term president. I'd give them 8 years, some would give them 6 years. I'm offended that our presidents, whether it's George Bush or whether it's President Obama, within 2 years of getting elected, are raising $1 billion to get reelected. I think both political parties spend too much time running for reelection and not enough time serving. We live, as I said, with the illustration about the exponential growth of population, we live in a world that's different than the world we were born into. When I got elected to Congress, I have to say this carefully, the Watergate baby class was a progressive version of the Tea Party. We unseated 5 committee chairmen in the House. We unseated Eddie Hebert, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Wright Patman, chairman of the Banking Committee, and Wilbur Mills, who had fallen into the tidal basin, who were chairs only by seniority. We unseated them because of our energy around reform. People need to recognize they ought not to get elected to think of it as service for life. It's service for the people. Now, you can take my numbers, change them, alter them, make them longer, but I think recycling House members gives you a sense of change. Senate needs to get back to being what the Senate was intended to be, which was a deliberative body, longer terms, less political. A lot of our senators became super House members. The more pork they could bring back to their states, the more opportunity they had to get reelected. Where are the Jake Javitzes? Where are the Senator Brooks? Where are the Hines and Schweiker? Where are the senators and the House members who see their service as a public service? And where are the young people thinking about service in our government? I'm going to take your questions in a moment, but let me end with just a brief reading. President Barack Obama went out after the shooting of a congressperson in Arizona to a memorial service. And I don't really care what you think about President Obama, but he sometimes can be really articulate. I want to read something he said as he traveled to Arizona to attend the memorial service for Gabby Gifford. They held a public forum, and he said a word about someone I hope you'll remember. Her name is Christina Taylor Greene. She was the 9-year-old who was killed that same day. Here are the words of the president. Imagine, here was a young girl who was just becoming aware of our democracy, just beginning to understand the obligations of citizenship, just starting to glimpse the fact that someday she too might play a role in shaping her nation's future. As she had been elected to her student council, she saw public service as something exciting, something hopeful. She was off to meet her congresswoman, someone she was sure was good and important and might be a role model. She saw all of this through the eyes of a child, undimmed by the cynicism and vitriol that we adults all too often just take for granted. I want us to live up to her expectations. I want our democracy to be as good as she imagined it. All of us. We should do everything we can to make sure this country lives up to our children's expectations. Repeat after me. We are.
We are.
We are.
We are.
The leaders.
The leaders.
We have been waiting for.
We have been waiting for.
Thank you, Bob, and on behalf of the Byrd Center, before we move to questions, we want to give you a copy of our latest publication, which is a documentary history of congressional investigations, which may come in handy at Common Cause, and we put it to good use.
guy, Richard Dreyfuss, is a member of the board at Common Cause?
I think that's a good idea.
I think it should.
We're going to have questions now. In order to facilitate the folks hearing the questions in the overflow room, we're going to ask that you use our brand new wireless microphones, which we'll hand around as you raise your hands. So I'll have one and Lily will have one, and we will open the floor to questions.
You want the answers in English?
Preferably.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Questions? Square root of,
Is there now a case coming up to the courts to invalidate the Arizona law?
the case in the Supreme Court to invalidate the Arizona law already came up. And we had a conference last week on this very Supreme Court decision. Not Supreme Court, but federal court decision. The Arizona law on public financing is still in place. What they did was they took out a small portion of that law, which was called the trigger mechanism. It didn't invalidate the whole of the law. In fact, the case itself justified and said that public financing was valid, it was good, but they didn't believe that the trigger mechanism, which allowed the illustration I gave you where one candidate's money went up, the other who didn't take the public financing was increasing, that was invalidated, and it impacted not just on Arizona, it impacted on Connecticut, impacted on Maine. But those of us who have been strong supporters of public financing breathed a sigh of relief that the decision didn't wipe out public financing completely. And there's partial public financing in cities like New York, and there's public financing in cities like Portland, Oregon. One of my favorite places where public financing is at work is in Albuquerque, where they have a system of public financing, and a community organizer now sits on city council, happens to be a person of color, who had no money, no resources, and now is part of the political system. So it didn't kill public financing as we thought it might, but it did take out the trigger mechanism out of that law. And if you email me, and my email is just redgar@commoncause.org, I can give you a more technical answer to your question. But as a result of our conference last week, people came and breathed a sigh of relief that they didn't eliminate it completely. Also, I should tell you that in the Citizens United case, the 5 justices that voted to give corporations the ability that they had also said in the majority opinion that the House and Senate should pass a disclosure bill so that without a disclosure laws in place, and Congress failed, foreign corporations can now invest in politics. Without a disclosure law, anonymous donations can be made. And without disclosure laws, you're going to see a proliferation of what are called super PACs, which are raising gazillion money and are going to spend it in the campaign on independent expenditures, most of it on television and radio. And we're going to be tainted again by good money and bad money. There's going to be more bad money in the system, but some of the good guys are also saying, we're going to form super PACs. We're going to try to get around any restrictions of transparency. And by the way, the disclosure bill passed the House. In the Senate, it got 59 votes and failed. Check the Constitution. Common Cause believes that the filibuster is actually unconstitutional. It wasn't in the Constitution. It wasn't there for 50 years after the Constitution was written. It was used up till recently 4 or 5 times in a 2-year session. And yet in the last Congress, it was used 149 different times to block legislation. And on the issue of disclose, it got 59 votes but because it didn't get 60 votes to overcome the filibuster, it died. The Founding Fathers, if you go read the Federalist Papers, if you go back and read English common law, intended that majority rules with respect to the minority, and never intended there to be a supermajority. Think of all of your homeowners associations, churches, synagogues, all of your faculty meetings. If you needed a 2/3 majority or 60% of every person voting in order to pass things, it goes against the issue of democracy. And we have a federal, we would like to launch a federal lawsuit on the issue of the filibuster. If conservatives had not won the House of Representatives this year, if the Democrats had kept control, what you would have seen is the debate would have shifted to the Senate, and hundreds of filibusters would have been used, as they were used in the lame duck session. Remember, the 40 senators sent a letter to the president saying, we're going to filibuster every bill in the lame duck session. If you dare think about taxing the top 2% of the wage earners, if you dare put taxes on large corporations. And the president caved on that, and that's how you got past a few pieces of legislation in the lame duck session. But the filibuster was used as a hammer, as a threat. And we'd like to see us have a national conversation about whether or not the filibuster is constitutional. So the courts give us ulcers often, but the courts often make pretty reasonable decisions. You're going to see us struggle on the health care law that was passed. It's a fairly mild health care bill. It's not a radical health care bill. It's fairly mild. Different regions of the country have said different things about it. It'll end up in the Supreme Court, and given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, we'll hold our breath. Your question?
I'm really I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm really curious about the tax advantages that corporations have. It's my understanding that lobbying is tax deductible. The hire a lobbyist is tax deductible. But if I want to place an ad, and I had a reason for wanting to do this a few months ago, in a local newspaper or TV station or whatever, I couldn't deduct it as an individual. Now, something wrong with that in terms of Citizens United, it seems to me.
Yes. Let me say, when I served in Congress, I served on 7 committees. I have to say I scratched my head when bills came out of the Ways to Be Mean Committee. The Ways to Be Mean Committee is the tax writing committee. You may be surprised to know that during the Eisenhower administration, the marginal tax rate was 90%. Okay. We have this myth in our country that tax relief creates jobs. I think we also have a myth that we need to cut spending without raising revenues. I mentioned earlier at a dinner we had that we've conducted 2.5 wars, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, and a partial war in Libya, and we didn't raise taxes to pay for it. And we lowered tax rates for the wealthy and for corporations. Many of those corporations took their money overseas because corporations are, in some instances, larger than nations. And I have to say, I don't hear the Democrats or the Republicans saying very much about the fact the reason we're in the crisis we're in is we've conducted wars without paying for them. And so the way we pay for them is to pay on the back of not only middle class, but the poor, the working poor. And we need a fair tax system. It's time for an overhaul. It's time for reasonableness. There are some who want to lower the 35 tax percentage to 25%. It's probably not a bad idea if everybody paid 25%, but there are so many loopholes in the tax code that they end up paying zero or paying very little. And this effort by both Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate to say, we want the super committee that's been set up only to look at reductions of expenditures and not look at revenues is really, I think, a disservice both to education, universities, people, and we need to really review the tax system. I think every wealthy person ought to pay their fair share. I like Warren Buffett's idea that he ought not to be paying less than his secretary by percentage. I think there ought to be a fair percentage. I think there ought to be a corporate minimum tax that's paid. I think everybody needs to have their fair share, and I think most Americans believe that to be true. I don't know where some of my friends on Capitol Hill get this idea that people don't want fairness. They don't want balance. And again, I think a lot of it comes from corporate infusion. Let me just give you a secret. Our delegate may know about this, but there's a group called ALEC. Do you know about ALEC? It's the American Exchange Council. It's a pretty neat group. It has 2,000 state representatives in this group, each of whom pays $50. 2,000. Mostly Republicans, but some Democrats. And twice a year, they go to resorts, either in California or Florida, twice a year, or in New Orleans, as they just were. 2,000 legislators get together to talk about immigration laws, to talk about ID laws for voting, to talk about corporate issues. They do that twice a year. What most people don't know, it's an organization that has a tax status of a 501c3. They're not supposed to lobby. But along with the 2,000 legislators, there are 300 corporations that have co-equal seats, and they pay anywhere from $25,000 to $1 million, and they underwrite these vacation resorts for these legislators. And if you go on the ALEC website, all of these bills that you hear about in the newspaper, the immigration bill in Arizona, the same bill is introduced in other places because it's not written by the legislators, it's written by the corporations and these legislators sitting together. We did a very innocent thing. We wrote a letter to the IRS and said, we think that ALEC has a right to exist. We think conservatives ought to be able to write common legislation. Liberals ought to be able to write common legislation. But they ought not to be able to do that as a C3 if, in fact, the special interests are in the room, behind closed doors, influencing, writing legislation for BP and Exxon and Mobil Oil, as opposed to letting the legislators ask for information but not respond directly because those corporations are there. The tax code is written by the lobbyist on K Street. And that's a way in which we've got to say, let's figure out a better tax system for all of us and pay our fair share. Nobody wants to pay more taxes, but you don't want your libraries closed. When a tornado hits, or a tsunami hits, or an earthquake hits, or a hurricane comes to town, you want government to be there to respond. So you've got to pay your fair share. What's balance? There's another question.
I just wanted to ask, since the presidential election is gearing up, what can we do? Is there anything that we can do?
Bring
back
back
Nixon.
Nixon is now a liberal.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan would be pretty upset with a lot of the one-issue conversations that are taking place. So I think we live in a strange time. What can we do? I think there are some things we can do. Why is it that only 45% of our people vote, or 50%? Why isn't it 80 or 90% of our people? You heard a lot last year about registration fraud. Ask yourself, who's begging to fraudulently get registered? And you heard a little bit about voter fraud in Ohio. Colbert did a great show. He talked about it. He railed against this voter fraud, and he pointed out that it was something like 0.5,000% of the voters were fraudulently voting. Our problem isn't fraudulent voting. Our problem isn't registration fraud. Our problem is that our citizens don't vote. Here are some crazy things. Why not lobby that every baby born in the United States is registered to vote at birth? We now give them a social security number. Why should it be so hard to register? And why not at age 18, when they're eligible to vote, why isn't every veterans organization, every church, synagogue, and mosque holding a ceremony similar to what we hold for immigration, giving them a constitution and a flag, and giving them a certificate that they're now eligible to vote, and this certificate will be framed and gold-plated as they cast their first vote. And you know, when governments give back in times of economic distress stimulus money, we just gave back $600 a couple years ago to folks. This is a radical idea. Why not give $600 back to everybody who votes and $300 to everybody who doesn't vote? Doesn't mean you don't have to. I know it's a terrible idea, but there are nations where 80 and 90%, and there are some nations that actually punish people for not voting. I want to give incentives to vote. And then I want to make sure that redistricting takes place so that votes are fair and people's votes are counted. And the other thing you can do is ask some of your election people in the states, do you have machines to vote that can be audited and looked at? Do they have a paper trail so that if there is a close vote, you can actually decide who won? Some of you remember in Minnesota, a guy by the name of Al Franken won an election. He was a radio personality, and suddenly he got elected. He went back to Minnesota to run. One of the things that most of you don't know is that was the poster child on how to do it right, not how to do it wrong. Because in Minnesota, the person who runs the election is the Secretary of State. They had a nonpartisan Secretary of State. In every precinct in Minnesota, the voting machines had a paper trail. And there were 11 judicial cases by the person who lost the election by a narrow vote, and all 11 decisions by the courts looking at the data came out with exactly the same answer because they had a paper trail. If that same election were held in Pennsylvania, we would still not know who won the election. So what can you do? Take ownership of your election process. Have people learn how to monitor the elections. Encourage young people and others to run for public office. Support candidates. Give them small contributions. Work. Do the shoe letter. You know. This, do that and help them get elected. But then once elected, hold them accountable. I learned 3 really important lessons when I got elected to Congress. The first lesson was the system of government we have is more human than I thought it was. We don't elect the brightest and best. We elect those who get more than half of their constituents to send them there. Some of them turn out pretty good. They're not bad people when they get elected, but they're human beings. And they're not all-knowing and all-wise. It scares me sometimes to think of who has their finger on the nuclear button. The second thing I learned is the system is complicated. I had 7 committee assignments. I was a specialist in public transportation. I wrote the Montgomery bill, the GI Bill. I've been involved in trying to clean up Agent Orange in Vietnam and provide compensation for our veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange. I'm doing a Ford Foundation project on that. I knew a lot about Veterans Affairs. I was an anti-war activist, the first anti-war activist to be on Veterans Affairs. I learned that you can love the warrior even if you oppose the war. And on Public Works, I was the infrastructuralist who wanted to see public transit and resources on water used and not pork barreled. But on all other things, I was a generalist. And I had these 7 committees. I voted 1,000 times publicly and many times back in committees and subcommittees. I was like a television set with somebody constantly changing the channel. So the system's more human, it's more complicated. The third thing is, it doesn't work unless you guys get involved in it. And here's a good lesson. Stop sending letters and emails. Or if you send a letter, it's the least effective way to lobby an elected official. You send a letter, make it a personal letter. Write it. Best way to lobby an elected official is eye contact, and visit them in their office, visit them back here in the state, do it twice a year, talk to them. You may know more about world hunger than they do. You may know more about a particular issue than they do. Get that eye contact. A rule of thumb is do unto an elected official what you would have done unto yourself if you were that elected official. Eye contact is best. As far as congressmen, a second way to lobby is recognize that of all the gazillion issues, congressmen have staff people who handle those issues. Some of the staff have 1,000 issues, 500 issues, 400 issues, 300 issues. Get to know which name is on that issue that you care about, whether it's homeless issues or whether it's hunger or whether it's a particular issue. And go visit them and begin to have them know who you are as a person. Oh, by the way, back here on eye contact, if you can't get your elected official to actually meet with you, it's very easy. Give them an award. If you don't like them, don't give them a nice award. Mimeograph or photocopy an award. If you don't agree with anything they've done, give them an attendance award. But when they come to get their award and they have the press and the media there, don't give it to them first. Have David come up and say, Congressman, it's really great to have you here. We're glad that you've come. We're honored. You serve on the Commerce Committee and you did something good. We want to honor you for that. But before we give you the award, Sally wants to talk to you about her concern about the fact that in this debate on deficits and you're not talking about children and you're talking about taking money away from Head Start programs that are so vital to our community. And she talks and then she says, oh, and by the way, Jake over here, he'd like to tell you about a local issue here in the community that is impacting. Use the opportunity as a teaching opportunity, and then 45 to 50 minutes into the introduction, that's when you hand the award. Because these elected officials, you know, I came home with 400 awards. And the neat thing is, when I was out in California and president of a graduate school, a friend of mine was a woodworker, and this happened to be a churchy seminary that I was president of. He took all my awards that my wife wouldn't let in the house because they were just too many, and he made religious symbols out of them that I took all over the world by taking the names of stuff off and using the wood for a good purpose. We were recycling. You know, I had boxes of awards, but I always thought it was a mistake when I got the award so quickly that the people giving the award didn't think to educate. Again, do unto an elected official. Eye contact, staff contact, telephone contact, particularly to their district office, and when you call on the phone, ask for something. I'd like a Library of Congress report, if you can find one, on this new super committee in Congress that's going to come up with a solution on deficit and debt. Can you figure out what's happening, or do you have a report on how much money we've invested in Iraq and Afghanistan without raising resources to pay for it? Right. Or, you know, whatever issue is passionate to you, ask for something, and if you call the district office, they have to call the national office. It then goes to the particular agency, comes back through, and you're educating the staff. And finally, if you're going to write a letter, I used to get 1,000 letters, all that say the same thing, and 5 that were personally written. That meant I had 6 inputs, and I represented 520,000 people. I knew that these folks were good organizers, but in terms of changing my mind, it was the personal letter that made a difference. And there were letters and personal communications that made a difference. And another secret is, if you really want to get to them, put personal and confidential on the outside of the that at least gets to their executive assistant. And if you really want to be snarly, especially for male elected officials, dip it in perfume. There are ways to communicate with elected officials. Be creative. One final question, two final questions, your question, quickly.
Given your background, would you make a few comments on the, say, politicking from the pulpit?
Yes, I believe strongly in the separation of church and state, but not the separation of people of faith and institutions of government. I think churches ought not to be the place where politics are, but I don't think churches should be devoid of inviting people from both political parties to talk about poverty, talk about the environment, talk about justice issues. I've read the Koran, and I've read the Torah, and I've read the Old Testament, and I've read the New Testament. And I gotta say, God was not a prosperity gospel guy. God tended to, in all of those traditions, there are 26 different religious traditions that say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There are 26 different religious traditions where God seems to be saying, care about the least of these, our brothers and sisters on planet Earth. So I don't want the churches and the synagogues and the mosques to not be engaged in the political conversation. But I don't want any institutional religious organization to own government. I'm not worried about Romney's Mormonism. I want to know what he thinks. I'm not worried about Obama, whether he goes to church every Sunday. Ronald Reagan was the Christian president, never went to church.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter was the Christian president who always went to church. But I don't want the bishop of the Methodist Church to dictate policies, but I don't want them also to step out of life. I want them to have comment. And it's tricky, but I think that I want the people who get elected to live their faith statements. And I want people of faith who feel strongly about issues, even those issues I disagree with, to be able to communicate with those legislators. But I don't want any faith tradition to think that they own the government. And since we just celebrated 10 years of 9/11, there's a great statement that I helped to write on the National Council of Churches website. It was written within 48 hours of 9/11. It's signed by 4,000 religious leaders. The first two it's entitled, Don't Let Us Become the Nation the Terrorists Think We Are. And the first two paragraphs share our compassion for those who lost their lives in 9/11. The second two paragraphs talk about the first responders who did such a good job. But the rest of the document said, look, this Constitution did not make us a Christian nation. We persecuted each other. We hung people because of their faith. We made people witches and other kinds of things. And finally we came to the decision that we respect all faith traditions, including those who have no faith tradition. I said that on television recently, and my oldest son, or my youngest son, who happens to be an atheist, tweeted me and said, Dad, thanks for the shout out. I really think that, if your faith statement brings you to the core of your faith, you're going to care about the poor, you're going to care about the stewardship of the planet, and you're going to ask yourself, how do we become peacemakers? And I got to say, we're very ignorant about the 7 different varieties of the Muslim traditions. Many of us don't know very much about the texture. And there are radicals in all of our faith traditions. There are radical positions in all of the faith traditions. But there are also a lot of good people. And my complaint is the good people don't speak out clearly enough on what they think is important, not just from their faith perspective, but from what's in the best interest of our nation and our future. Okay. I'll stick around. Let me just leave you with 2 quotes, very quick quotes. Hubert Humphrey said, the moral test of government is what we do for those in the dawn of life, our children, those in the twilight of life, the elderly, and all of those in the shadows of life, the poor, the sick, and the disabled. But there was another politician who went into South Africa in 1966 came away horrified at what he saw. And he said this: "Let no one be discouraged by the belief that there is nothing that one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills, against misery and ignorance, injustice, or violence. Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events so that in the total of all those acts is written the history of our generation." I had you chant, "If you want to walk fast, walk alone." Our African proverb. But the key line is, if you want to walk far, walk together. Figure out ways in this community, in this university, you can walk together for justice.
There are refreshments in the lobby, please.